thing about banks is that they can often impose more restrictions. They can monitor the company better. And if the company goes bankrupt, they can make sure that it doesn't get liquidated. They can see it through the bankruptcy. And so you can avoid a lot of the costs of liquidation. But the cost is that companies knowing that won't be as scared about going into bankruptcy, right? So they might not work as hard. How about public equity? Is Zianis here? Zianis Propenka? No. Anyone else want to say what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of public equity? Prashank, do you?
Yeah. I think the biggest disadvantage is as you mentioned before, the thing that's happening with Facebook, where current investors are so worried about making more money right now that they're not sort of waiting on Facebook sort of coming up with a better strategy and give instant gratification. But at the same time, you have a massive market to get capital from and raise capital really quickly.
Yeah, I also think in addition to the disadvantage that you were talking about, there's the disadvantage that it's very hard for dispersed equity holders to monitor the company to make sure it's not stealing from them, whereas it's much easier for a venture capitalist or friends and family to do that. Okay, so that is that on sort of that half of the lecture. So now, if I were going through a systematic, normal micro course, I would now try to talk about production by firms and costs and so forth. But I know all you guys have done that many, many times. So I'm going to try to instead skip to the notion of a supply curve and to talk about what a supply curve is and how we should interpret it. And thinking about time in relationship to supply curves. Okay, so the idea behind a supply curve, well, actually, Ginny, what do you think a supply curve is?
It reflects how many units the firm is willing to produce
If a given price. Yeah, that's right. So that's the traditional notion of a supply curve. But the issue with that is that production takes time. And so the question is, if the price is equal to something for how long, and how much would the firm produce over what period, right? And that's sort of left out when we talk about these things. And it's always sort of confusing, I think, a little bit, what we mean by a static model. What do we mean the firm produces this much if the price is that? What does that mean in actual time? You know what I mean? So that's what I'm going to try to think about for the next 45 minutes to an hour. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Is there an analogous thing for demand curve as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm just doing this in the context of supply, but everything I'm going to talk about, in fact, I'll even talk about some examples from demand where it applies. Okay. So we're going to try to think about what does a static model actually mean. I think a lot of confusion in economics comes from the fact that people don't really have a sense what a static model actually means. And therefore, they think that to think about anything with any amount of time, they have to think about dynamics. And I think that's really, really, really naive. I think that actually there's a lot of stuff about time and that you can say using static models. And that was Marshall's view as well. So I'm going to try to convince you of that. So here's how I want you to think about a supply curve. I want to think of it as an issue of time averaging. So the quantity supplied is the average quantity per unit time supplied over some duration. And the price is something that may be moving up and down over time, but it's sort of the average price. And therefore, when we think of price shifting and therefore moving along a supply curve, I want to think of some sort of uniform upward shift or downward shift in the path of prices. So what I mean by a supply curve is how does the average quantity over a certain amount of time change when we shift uniformly up or down the path of prices. Okay. And I want to think of this all as holding fixed anything that's not under the control of the firm, like future prices beyond this period. So then clearly, it's just obvious once you say that the supply curve depends on exactly what time period you're thinking about. how long it is, and which time period it is in general. Okay. And this is basically the notion that I want to say. I mean, I don't know what you guys think a short-run supply curve and a long-run supply curve are. They're not usually really very clearly defined. But I want to define this pretty precisely. The short-run supply curve, and by short, I mean literally 3 years or some number of years, right, is if we take some typical 3-year period from the firm, maybe starting today or something like that, what would be the effect on the average quantity it supplies over that period if all the prices in that period were to move upward uniformly by some amount? Okay. And these curves denote reactions to prices or demand shifts corresponding to different durations. The longer is the duration, the longer is the run of production. So what does run mean here? I literally mean how long the run of production is. Okay. And the typical logic of why, how these things differ is that more durable choices that last for some amount of time, can be adjusted the longer is the relevant run. And so these runs are usually identified with various factors that adjust over different periods of time. Usually we think of the short run as being like variable factors like unskilled labor and raw materials can be adjusted. In the medium term, maybe plant sizes and production methods can be adjusted. And in the long term, new firms can enter and new supplies of the factors to the firm can come onto line. Yeah?
By run, you mean the period you're concerned about, or like how long the production takes?
No, the period we're considering. Yeah. Now, there's lots of counterexamples to the identification with short, medium, and long of these various things. So I don't know if anyone followed Groupon, but within about 3 months of Groupon opening, there were like 100 different competitors to Groupon. I mean, it was amazing how quickly firms entered into that market. On the other hand, the medical industry has been, the computer has entered, and in many areas, the computer was adopted within like months. And yet the medical industry has basically not adopted computers over the last 40 years. So what exactly falls into each of these categories depends on lots of institutional features as well as on literally what types of factors they are. And so I think, when we say short and long run, it's really very casual. What we really mean is like this many year run in this institutional context versus this many year run in this institutional context. But, so here's the typical picture that's shown. So the typical picture that's shown is that the short run cost curve, marginal cost, is less elastic than the long run marginal cost and therefore supply curve are. And that the short run cost curve is the upper envelope of the long run average cost curve. And in fact, you usually do a bunch of these. So the long run curve is just the upper envelope of a bunch of these short run curves. Why is that? Because you choose the short run curve at a particular production level so as to be the best one possible for the long run. So it's going to have to be tangent to it at that point because you're using the best technology possible and you're just running along that short run curve. That's called the envelope theorem. Okay. Now, the question is, why, this analysis is all based on the idea that you can change more things in the long run than you can change in the short run. And is Xiaolong here? No? Does anyone else want to say, what's the implicit assumption that lies behind the standard idea that you can adjust more in the short run, in the long run than in the short run? Yeah, David.
Market frictions, like it's search cost to get capital and install it, those things take the same time.
Yeah, things take time. That's getting a little bit closer, I would say. So the key thing is things are supposed to take time. Some choices are durable, and therefore they're costly to change quickly. And that's certainly true for some things, but definitely not for everything. And it really depends on whether things are intertemporal complements or intertemporal substitutes. So what do I mean by intertemporal complements or durables? Is Nelson here? Nelson Zhu? No? Anyone else? Yeah, Chrissy.
I can try to take a stab
Yeah.
at the wording. So an intertemporal complement means that the good itself is a complement with time, over time. So it just lasts and it's meant to be consumed a long period.
Yeah.
And then conversely, the substitutes would be.
Well, we'll get to the substitutes in a second. But I will come back to you, okay? So, yes, intertemporal complement is something that lasts for, say, a fixed period of time, and that it depreciates with time. So if you get further and further away, the good is less good to use later, right? And therefore, it doesn't make sense to change this sort of good frequently. Another way to put this is it's very cheap to use it during its scarce lifespan, but very expensive to use it outside of that. So like an example of that is you often say for a durable that you're being wasteful if you fail to use the durable. So like if you own an airplane and it just sits there, people will say, oh, it's such a waste, you have this airplane and you're not using it, right? Because it's very cheap to use it as long as it's within the time that it lasts for, right? A good example of that is where you live, right? The place where you live, you might say, you're not taking advantage of this city, right? During the time you're there, it's something that's very expensive to change during the time you're there, and that therefore you should sort of use while you have the chance, right? Yeah,
So
James.
Do you really need it to even depreciate though?
Well,
Because I could just, like, if I'm not using it, then I could have put the money that I was putting into the durable into something else and earn an interest rate. So it just needs to, I just need to.
yeah, I mean, it has to depreciate relative to the market. I mean, all this stuff is relative to the relevant market option, but yeah. Intertemporal substitutes or storables. Chrissy, start again. What are those?
Right. It's something that is used up, so it doesn't last over time. It becomes very expensive to keep buying these things over and over again.
Yeah, so the way I used to like to think about it is that if it's time that depreciates a durable, it's use that depreciates a storable. So these are things that last forever in principle, but what causes them to go away is the use of them, right? And we would therefore never say that candy is something that you would never say about like candy or oil that like, oh, it's such a waste that you don't use that, right?
You can either have your cake or you can eat it. But you can
Yeah,
eat it.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, cake is actually not such a great example because that does depreciate with time. But it's something you can really store. No, but it's true. I know, but that's what you're thinking of when you say the expression "you can't have your cake and eat it too." Yeah, David.
For like an airplane, is it really like the time that's causing the airplane to depreciate, or that how often you're running?
Well, I think James made the point, which is that opportunity, the cost of that money, causes it to effectively depreciate with time. Short-term changes in things that are intertemporal substitutes are cheap. Long-term changes in them are expensive. It's the opposite of the other thing, right? Because like it's cheap to like have a little bit more candy now. Imagine there's a type of candy that's now gone out of sale, so you can't buy any more of it. It's really cheap to have just a little bit more of it today, but if you want to have more of it all the time, then you have to like go and find how to produce it or something like that, right? So these are things which are expensive to use during their very long lifetime. You would say, oh God, don't use that up for a light purpose, right? You only have so much of it. We know that there's some things which we say that about, and there's some things which we say the opposite about. And some are intertemporal substitutes, some are intertemporal complements, right? A great example of this is a vacation, I think. So a vacation is something which is really cheap to delay by a few months, but it would be really expensive to never take a vacation. You'd drive yourself nuts, right? And that's sort of the opposite of where you live, right? Okay, so all of this depends on context, but typically I would say that some very durable things are entry by firms into countries or industries, education that you get, and probably even more durable are cultural, political, economic, and social institutions, probably in decreasing order. So